Please, hold me like we are in love." Katherine Mercer heard her own voice and hated the way it quivered in the middle of the packed concourse at O'Hare Airport in Chicago, where the sound of suitcase wheels scraping across the tile floor felt like claws dragging through memory. She had just stepped off a business flight, still carrying the stale scent of cold airplane air and watery coffee. Her mind set on only one thing: getting back to her cramped apartment, locking the door, and pretending life had finally stopped enjoying its cruel little games. But then that laugh cut through the noise like a blade. A laugh she once called home, now nothing more than a reminder of a marriage discarded like trash. Brandon Pierce was walking toward her, his hand resting casually on the back of a polished woman, the kind of woman who looked as though she had been born to stand under bright lights, and his smile made it painfully clear he wanted Katherine to see just how much he had upgraded. Katherine froze, her palms dampened with sweat. Her throat went dry and raw, because she couldn't let him see her alone, couldn't let him smell the crack still bleeding inside her. Then her eyes landed on a man moving against the flow of travelers, with a calm that was almost unsettling. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark suit that wasn't flashy, but tailored so sharply, people seemed to step aside without thinking, as if the air itself made room for him. He didn't stare at anyone for long. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't showing off. Yet the way he walked carried a kind of power that didn't need an introduction. Katherine didn't have time to think. She rushed forward, grabbed his sleeve like a drowning woman grabbing a lifeline, and looked up with eyes that were both stubborn and desperate. "Please," she whispered, "pretend to hold me, just for a second." The man stopped short, his gaze, piercing and glacial, swept over her unfamiliar face as if measuring risk. But then something shifted, quick and subtle, behind his eyes. He didn't ask why. He didn't pull away. He drew her close against his chest, just enough to hide her trembling from every passing glance, just enough to make anyone approaching understand she was not alone. The scent of his cologne, clean, expensive, and icy, wrapped around Katherine like temporary armor, and for a single moment she almost forgot this was only an act. Brandon and his new fiancé stopped directly in front of them. Brandon's expression darkened when he saw Katherine tucked into the arms of a stranger, while Katherine forced herself into a steady smile, as if her heart were not being crushed to pieces. The man beside her leaned slightly, like a wall against the wind, his voice low and calm enough to make any bragging sound cheap. "Is there a problem?" He didn't offer a long introduction, but the way he stood, the way his hand settled behind Katherine's back, said he was used to watching others take a step back. Brandon tried to smile, but that smile faltered against the cold presence in front of him, and Katherine realized the strangest thing was not that she was pretending to be the girlfriend of a powerful man. It was that his arms made her feel safe in a way she had thought she was no longer allowed to feel. And just as she started to believe she had escaped this humiliating moment, a sharp, dry pop cracked somewhere nearby, like a balloon bursting, but the sound that followed was shattering glass and people screaming. The man tightened his grip on Katherine, turning her in a single reflex, pulling her behind a stone pillar. A bullet lodged deep into the surface behind where she had been standing only seconds before, leaving the bitter smell of scorched metal in the airport's cold air. Katherine opened her mouth, but no sound came out. He lowered his face to hers, looking straight into her eyes, his voice still terrifyingly steady. "Now listen to me," he said. "Don't turn around, don't run blindly, and don't leave my side." She had asked for an embrace to hide her pain, but it seemed she had accidentally clung to a man whose world did not allow anyone to touch him and remain unharmed. If you want to know how Katherine will survive after that moment, please hit like to support the channel. Don't forget to share this story with your friends and loved ones. And remember to subscribe so you won't miss the next episodes. The scream was still echoing in Katherine's ears when the man tightened his grip and pulled her away from the stone pillar, as if dragging someone back from a cliff's edge, not running in panic, but moving along cold, straight lines that had been calculated in advance, avoiding the harsh pools of light, avoiding the crowd surging toward the crash of breaking glass, and avoiding anything that could become a second trap. She caught only a brief glimpse of his hand pressed to the middle of her back, firm and decisive. As if he'd done this so many times, his body remembered the route without thought. The scorched metallic smell still threaded through the air-conditioned air. The security announcements looped in a dry, practiced tone, telling passengers to remain where they were, then shifting to orders to evacuate, then choking off under the sheer volume of noise. Katherine wanted to look back. She wanted to know where Brandon was. She wanted to be sure his new fiancé had seen him standing there like a statue. But the man lowered his voice at exactly the right moment, just enough for it to fall straight into her spine. "Don't look back." And strangely, she obeyed, because there was no confusion in his eyes, no wildness of someone who'd just escaped death, only the razor focus of a person who knew another set of eyes was still watching them through a scope. When they cut through a side corridor, Katherine realized he wasn't alone. At first she thought they were just other passengers from the same flight, dark suits coincidentally moving in the same direction. But then everything clicked together like a terrifying puzzle. A man with closely cropped hair positioned himself slightly to the left to block the viewing angle from the glass doors. Another held a phone, while his eyes never left the stream of people. And farther down, someone who looked like a janitor pushed a cart of supplies, except that cart had just happened to stop in the exact spot that blocked a ceiling camera placed to capture Katherine's face. A shiver ran through her as she understood. They were locking down sightlines, not with violence, but with precision. The man guided her into a shadowed recess near an emergency exit, where the noise dulled behind thick walls and footsteps sounded soft on rubber flooring. Only then did he ease the pressure of his hold, but he didn't release her completely, as if the moment she moved outside his radius by even half a step, what had just happened would swing back and strike again. Katherine swallowed hard. Her throat burned. Her lips shuddered, and she hated that they did. She tried to find her voice inside the chaos. "Who are you?" He didn't answer right away. He tilted his head as if listening for something she couldn't hear, his eyes scanning the corridor, the reflections in the glass, each person running past. When he looked back at her, his voice stayed calm, but each word felt like an order wrapped in velvet. "Did you see anything?" Katherine blinked, her mind stretched thin. What did she see? Only the bullet, the broken glass, the humiliation smothered by fear. But then, as if a photograph developed in her head, she remembered the moment right before the sharp pop, a figure standing at the edge of the crowd on the mezzanine level, near the metal railing, where the overhead lights made everything look hazy, almost like mist. She hadn't seen a face, but she remembered a detail so small it should have slipped away, so small it would have vanished if she hadn't spent her whole life collecting signs to keep herself safe. A thick silver ring on the middle finger, marked with a scratch, as if it had been gouged, and a black earpiece on the right ear, the cheap kind, with a wire visible beneath the collar. She got it out, her voice breaking. A silver ring, middle finger, a scratch on it, a black earpiece, mezzanine level, near the railing. The man held her gaze for a beat, and that look wasn't suspicion. It was recognition, like someone confirming a piece in place. He murmured something to the closely cropped-haired man, who nodded and disappeared like a shadow. So fast, Katherine suddenly felt she was standing between two worlds, one being her ordinary life, where she worried about rent and schedules, and the other being a life where people vanished with a single nod. Katherine clutched her bag strap, trying to keep herself from collapsing. She wanted to ask more. She wanted to ask why someone had fired, why they'd aimed at them, why a fake hug had led to a real bullet. But he didn't give her time to sink into questions. He pulled a small phone from the inside of his jacket. Not a luxury model, no glossy case, something that looked like it was meant to be used and then thrown away. He tapped quickly and handed it to her, and Katherine saw there was only one number on the screen. No name, no contacts, nothing else. She looked up at him, her fingers turning frigid. "What is this?" he answered. "A one-time contact number." She didn't understand, but the way he said one time made its meaning land like a car horn blaring inches from her ear. One wrong call, one wrong word, one bad trust, and you dig your own grave. Katherine opened her mouth to protest that she didn't want anything to do with his world, but he cut in, not harshly, simply decisive, like a door shutting. "You've been seen. From now on, you're a variable." The phrase turned her spine to ice, because she knew too well what it felt like to have other people decide your fate, and she'd thought she'd escaped it when she walked away from Brandon. She forced her voice toward calm, though pain still tightened her chest. "I'm just a stranger." He looked straight at her. No dodging, no soothing lies. That's exactly why it's dangerous. Whoever fired doesn't care who you are. They care who you were standing beside. If you walk out of here alone, you become the easiest target to send a message. Katherine wanted to laugh at the absurdity. She wanted to say her life had already been cruel enough. Please don't add this insane script. But then she saw, At the far end of the corridor, a person in a black jacket scanning as if searching for someone, and when that person stopped at a spot where they'd have a clear line of sight toward her, if they took only a few more steps, Katherine realized she couldn't keep pretending. The man touched her wrist lightly, a small signal, controlled and absolute, drawing her deeper into the shadows, and his voice dropped. "Tonight, you're not going home." Katherine went stiff. "No." He didn't argue. He only said one sentence, like a stamp pressed onto her fear. "If you want to live, trust me for at least one night." Katherine looked down at the small phone in her hand, feeling as if she were holding a thin wire leading into a world she'd never wanted to enter. And she hated having to admit the simplest truth. Right now, in an airport that was screaming, under cameras and locked sightlines, with a bullet still buried behind her where she'd been standing, she had no choice but to follow him, at least until the sun came up. Katherine couldn't remember which way she'd left the airport. She only remembered being pushed through back corridors, as if moving inside a dark pipe, where the noise was left behind with each layer of doors, and the small phone lay ice-cold in her palm like a piece of evidence. The man brought her to a black car parked in a pickup area away from the main flow, with no signage, no show, yet everything around it seemed to yield as if an invisible order were already at work. Inside the car, he didn't try to comfort her, and he didn't offer his life story. He asked exactly one more time about the ring and the earpiece, then fell silent and watched the window while the driver took winding turns as if cutting a tail. Katherine sat upright, shoulders drawn tight like wire. She tried to breathe evenly. She tried to tell herself this was only an incident, that maybe the shooter had aimed at someone else, that she'd simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But every time she tried to lull herself, the image of the bullet buried in the stone pillar snapped back like a slap. He took her somewhere safe enough to wait out the chaos, an empty apartment scrubbed clean of human scent, with multiple locks and heavy curtains, where yellow lamplight made everything look quiet in a way that felt almost artificial. When it grew late, he stood near the door and spoke in an even tone, like reading the news. "Tonight you stay here. Early in the morning, I'll have someone take you back to get your things. You don't call anyone except this number. You don't share details with anyone, even family. And if you see anything strange, you call immediately." Katherine wanted to protest, wanted to ask what right he had to issue orders like that. But the words stuck in her throat because she understood it too. If this was a game run by powerful people, she had no standing to bargain while she was still shaking. When the black of night began to thin, his people brought her back to her own apartment like a shadow. The car stopped at a distance that wouldn't draw attention, and Katherine stepped out with the feeling she'd lived through a night that didn't belong to her life. Her familiar small apartment hit her all at once, the smell of cheap laundry detergent and cold leftovers, and she almost wanted to cry because it was so normal, as if everything at the airport had been a fabricated nightmare. But the moment she slid her key into the lock, her hand paused. Not because she feared the dark, but because she feared false peace. She went inside, locked the door, pulled the curtains, and stood for a moment in the cramped living room, listening to the refrigerator's steady hum. Then she forced herself into small tasks, as if proving life was still within reach. She rinsed a mug in the sink. She changed her clothes. She set her bag down in the same corner as always. Her personal phone vibrated, Brianna's name lighting the screen, and Katherine realized she hadn't even had time to plan a lie. She answered and tried to sound normal, but Brianna caught the hoarseness in her breathing right away. She pressed with questions. Was the business trip okay? Why had she gotten messages about an incident at O'Hare? People were saying they'd heard a bang. Was it true? Katherine looked at the one-time phone on the table beside her keys, as if it were looking back at her, and she only said, briefly, that there'd been an incident at the airport. Security was in chaos. She was exhausted and wanted to sleep. She was fine. Brianna didn't believe her, but she didn't force it. She told her to lock the door tight, drink water, don't try to be strong all by herself. Then she hesitated and asked a question that made Katherine's heart ache because it landed on an old wound. Was Brandon doing something again? Katherine swallowed hard and said no. This time it wasn't about him, then ended the call faster than she normally would, feeling as if she'd shoved her best friend out of the safe zone to keep her from being dragged in. Night settled fully. The quieter the apartment became, the more clearly Katherine could hear blood rushing in her ears. She set an early alarm, but she couldn't sleep. She lay staring at the ceiling, where the lamp cast a tired halo of light. Near midnight, her phone screen lit up once, only once, and the words that appeared made her skin turn to ice. If you open your mouth, you die. There was no number, only a string of strange characters, the kind of message someone sends and then vanishes. Katherine jerked upright, her heart pounding as if it might split. But what terrified her even more was the sudden clarity that flooded in, as if her body had switched itself into the survival mode that once helped her grow up through days when no one protected her. She didn't scream. She didn't call back. She didn't reply. She took a screenshot. She marked the time by opening the clock and taking another photo to create an anchor, then copied the text into her notes, as if saving evidence for a trial she didn't yet know would ever happen. She remembered the man's rule: call no one except the one-time number. But her hand still shook as she reached for it and set it beside her like a life preserver. She got up and went to the window, lifting the curtain just enough to look down at the street below. The streetlights glowed a pale yellow. Wind pushed scraps of trash in slow circles, and across the way, under the shadow of a tree, a man leaned against a car as if smoking. Except he wasn't smoking. He was simply looking up in the exact direction of her apartment, standing still far too long for someone passing by. Katherine dropped the curtain at once, her back against the wall, feeling as if all the air in the room had been pulled out. She wasn't thinking about Brandon anymore, or pride, or whether he'd seen her with a powerful man. She was thinking about one chilling truth that had just stamped itself onto her life, that someone knew where she was, knew how she could be broken, and they'd sent a warning before dawn to make sure she understood the bullet at O'Hare hadn't been a mistake. Katherine grabbed her coat, slipped a few important documents into her bag, switched her keys and wallet into a smaller purse, then forced herself to make a plan the way someone plots delivery routes, writing down the building's exits, which doors might open, what hours were crowded, what hours were empty, and deciding that tomorrow morning she wouldn't take her usual way. She'd change routes. She'd loop through the main street where cameras were. She wouldn't let herself become a stationary target. When she sat down on the edge of the bed again, her hand still clamped around the one-time phone, she understood with aching clarity that this was far beyond the humiliation of being discarded by an ex-husband, that this was no longer a story about saving face. This was a hunt, and she'd been dragged into the role of prey even though she'd never asked to play. Morning came to Katherine like a thin cut. Gray light seeped through the curtains, making her cramped apartment look even more exhausted, and the feeling of being watched from the night before still clung to her skin like cold dust. She hadn't slept much, only drifted in and out before jolting awake before the alarm could even ring, moving through the plan she'd drawn in her mind, as if preparing to run from a fire. She dressed simply. She tied her hair back. She slid her documents into a small bag. The one-time phone sat tight against her in her coat pocket, like a piece of metal that could save her life. When she stepped out, she locked the door 3 times, listening to the dry click of the bolt, then paused for a beat to listen to the hallway. No footsteps, no breathing, yet the silence didn't soothe her. It only made her feel as if she were walking on a taut wire. She took the stairs instead of the elevator, avoided the familiar camera angle, and slipped out by a side route that looped past the back doors, exactly as she'd planned. For the first few minutes, everything looked so normal, she almost scolded herself for panicking. Told herself the message might have been nothing more than cheap intimidation, told herself the man under her building might have only been a smoker waiting for someone. But the moment she crossed a stretch of street near a small coffee shop where people were lined up for takeout, she felt something that didn't belong to ordinary life press against the back of her neck like a breath, and she knew it wasn't imagination. 2 men appeared at her sides as if they'd already been moving with the crowd all along. They didn't rush her. They didn't make a scene. They simply matched her pace, one close behind at exactly an arm's length, the other angled ahead as if accidentally blocking her path. Katherine kept her face steady and tried speeding up, then slowing down, but their distance didn't change, like elastic always pulling her back to the center. She turned onto the main street with cameras, just as she'd planned, and at that moment the man in front shifted his shoulder to partially block the view, his voice low enough that no one nearby could hear. "Follow us and you won't be hurt. Don't make this awkward." Katherine went cold. Her heart slammed against her ribs, but she lifted her chin, forced herself to look into eyes that held no emotion, and told him to move, then tried to slip past. The man behind her touched her elbow lightly, not squeezing, not yanking, only placing his hand there like a mark of ownership. And that lightness was the most terrifying part, because it said they didn't need violence to take her. They only needed to make sure she couldn't scream in time. She opened her mouth to shout, but the man in front tilted his head like a hook and gestured toward the distance, toward a woman holding a child, toward an older man paying at a counter, as if reminding her that one scream would pull everyone into danger. Katherine swallowed. Her hand searched for the one-time phone in her coat pocket. Her fingers shook, but her mind burned sharp as a blade. She didn't dial. She only pressed the power button so the screen lit up, and that small glow reflected on her palm and brought back the words from the night before, that she was a variable. The man behind her caught the movement, his eyes flashing for a beat, and in that same instant, like a seam splitting open in the crowd, a tall, lean man in a dark jacket stepped in from the curb. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He walked straight in like an arrow, his gaze colder than the morning. Katherine didn't even have time to understand before that hand knocked the man's grip off her elbow with a small, precise motion, followed by a wrist turn that dropped the other man to his knees, as if the strength had been pulled out of him. The man in front barely had time to react before the newcomer closed the distance, shoulder driving in, elbow blocking, and in a moment so short the people around them would have assumed it was nothing more than a street bump. Both men were shoved away from Katherine, off balance, forced to retreat into the gap between parked cars. Katherine stood frozen, her breath breaking out loud, and the man said without looking at her for long, "Go." His voice didn't need an introduction, but a name flared in her mind from scattered words at the airport, a name the powerful man had used when he gave orders in the shadows, Jace. He pulled Katherine forward fast toward a black car that slid up as if it had been waiting there all along, the back door opening at the right moment like a mouth. And Katherine jerked back, instinct flaring, because everything she knew about black cars ended in lost freedom. She yanked her arm, shook her head, said, "No, I'm not going anywhere. I'll call the police." But Jace didn't argue. He simply leaned in to block her from the line of sight of the two men he'd just dropped. His voice lower now, rougher. "You want to stay so they can try a second time right here in the street?" Katherine turned her head and saw one of them already standing again, not charging, only lifting a hand to his ear as if reporting, and the way he looked at her was the way someone looks at property that slipped out of their grasp. Fear turned into a decision. Not a free decision, but a survival one. And Katherine threw herself into the car, as if diving into a place that could lock a door behind her. The door slammed, the sound making her flinch, and as the car rolled forward, she turned and struck the glass as if she could open it again. But Jace was already in the front seat, looking at her in the rearview mirror, his voice even. "They don't want attention, but they don't mind taking you. And the more you stand in a crowd, the easier it is for them to turn you into a hostage to pressure someone else." Katherine swallowed, gripping her bag strap, eyes fixed on streets sliding backward, panic rising at the feeling of having her choices taken again. Like the day Brandon coldly declared she was dragging him down, only this time, it wasn't her heart being thrown away. It was her life. The car took turns that were hard to predict, crossed a bridge, cut into a quieter neighborhood, then stopped in front of a house that looked as ordinary as hundreds of others. Trimmed grass, closed windows, nothing that suggested this was shelter from a storm. When Katherine stepped inside, she realized ordinary could be camouflage, because there was a faint scent of disinfectant, a small camera tucked into a ceiling corner, a keypad lock, and eyes that swept over her with the speed of a weapons check. Rafe stood at the far end of the hallway, no longer wearing the airport coat, but the same unnerving calm still wrapped him like armor. And when his gaze met Katherine's, he didn't ask if she was scared. He only said one sentence that framed everything. "From now on, you do exactly what I say, so you stay alive long enough to choose again later." Katherine let out a hoarse laugh that sounded like she might cry, asked what this was. A prison, but Rafe didn't lose his temper. He stepped close enough for her to see the fatigue beneath his eyes, then laid down rules the way someone lays down law in a war zone, that she couldn't go outside alone. She couldn't use her personal phone unless it had been checked. She couldn't stand near windows. She couldn't tell anyone about this. And if she heard anything strange, she was to call immediately. Katherine wanted to say she didn't belong to him. She didn't belong to any system. But when she looked back at the front door and saw Jace posted there like a bolt, saw the layered locks and the cameras and the way everyone moved in silence, she understood something that chilled her to the bone, that this was no longer a story she could step out of with a simple shake of her head, that from the moment she'd asked for a hug at O'Hare, she'd walked into a network with its own rules, its own people, its own enemies, and getting out of it wouldn't be as simple as packing a bag and closing a door. Katherine had thought that once the safe house door shut, fear would soften, because at least here, no strangers could press in close, and no shadow would stand beneath a streetlight. But the quiet inside that ordinary-looking house carried a different kind of pressure, like a metal band tightening slowly around her chest. Rafe finished laying out his rules and then walked away as if they were just a task list, leaving Katherine in the hallway with her small bag and the sensation that her right to breathe at her own rhythm had been taken from her. Jace led her to a room with a clean bed and a window covered in frosted film, handed her a bottle of water, and said briefly that she should rest. But Katherine couldn't sleep. She sat on the edge of the bed and listened to footsteps moving through the house, the click of locks, doors opening and closing, and, now and then, a whisper that cut through the air like a blade. Near noon, she heard a car pull up and the front door open. There were no polite greetings, only a rush of cold air and the sense that something was about to happen. Katherine stood, stepped into the hallway, and saw in the living room a man seated on a chair with his hands bound, his mouth sealed with tape, his face bruised as if he'd been dragged out of a fight. 2 men stood on either side of him and didn't even look at her. They watched him the way someone watches property. Katherine stopped short, her heart hammering. Everything she knew about this world so far was Rafe's protective arm and the sound of a bullet at the airport. But what she was seeing now was something she'd never wanted to witness. Rafe stood across from the bound man, sleeves rolled up, no tie, and the calm on his face was more frightening than anger. He asked a short question, not shouted, yet the room went so still it felt as if the air had been pulled out. Who sold the schedule at O'Hare? The man shook his head hard, eyes wide and white, trying to make muffled sounds behind the tape. Rafe made a signal. The tape was peeled away, and pleading poured out like a dam breaking. That he didn't know anything. He only followed orders. That he had a small child. That he didn't want to die. Katherine went rigid, her back turning to ice, because the word die came out too easily, as if it were just a number in a ledger. Rafe didn't curse him. He didn't lecture. He only stepped closer and bent until his eyes were level with the man's. His voice heavy as stone dropped into water, saying that, in this house, there was only one thing that couldn't be bought. Loyalty, and anyone who traded it for money chose their own ending. Katherine opened her mouth to say stop, but someone near her lifted a hand as a warning not to come closer, and that helplessness made heat flare in her face. The man on the chair sobbed and said he'd only given a name, only said there was a woman at the airport, that it was just a small piece of information, that he hadn't thought they would shoot in a crowded place. Hearing that, Katherine felt her insides twist, because he was talking about her the way someone talks about a package. Rafe asked once more, whose name? And this time the man looked around as if searching for a way to live, then spat out a name like coughing up blood, Frank Moreau. Katherine didn't know who Frank Moreau was, but the way everyone in the room stiffened told her it was a name with the weight of lead. Rafe gave a small nod, as if he'd expected it, then straightened, not looking at Katherine, not looking at anyone, only giving a signal with 2 fingers. What happened next moved too fast for Katherine to understand. There was no long torture, no horrifying monologue, only a decisive motion, a sound that caught in a throat, and the traitor slumped as if a rope had been cut. Katherine blinked again and again. Her ears rang, her stomach rolled. She took a step back, and her foot struck a table leg with a soft knock, but it was enough for Rafe to turn. His eyes met hers, and in that moment, Katherine saw that what made him terrifying wasn't rage. It was the way he did something brutal, the way someone makes a business decision, clean and without hesitation. A ragged breath broke out of her, and then the words burst from her mouth as if shattering, "You just killed a man." Her voice shook, but not from weakness. It shook because every standard inside her was screaming. Rafe didn't deny it. He replied calmly that the man had chosen death the moment he sold the information. Katherine shook her head, her eyes burning, and said no one had the right to take another person's life like that. That this was insane, that she couldn't stay in a place where people were dealt with in front of her the way someone deals with a broken chair. Rafe watched her for a long time, as if weighing how much truth a person like her could take without collapsing. Then he spoke plainly, not gentle, not hidden, that territory war didn't allow weakness, and weakness meant death. Not only his death, but the death of the people under him, the loyal ones, the ones who would have their throats cut if he showed mercy in the wrong place. He repeated the name Frank Moreau, the way someone names a storm, saying Moreau didn't smear reputations, and didn't threaten for show. He shot. He burned. He erased traces. And he wouldn't stop just because Katherine was an outsider. Katherine listened with limbs gone cold, but she still tried to hold on to a moral anchor, saying she didn't belong to his war. She didn't want to become an excuse for him to kill, and she would leave as soon as she could, as soon as it was safe. Rafe held her gaze. This time his voice dropped, like a truth that couldn't be negotiated, saying she still believed safety was a door she could step through if she waited long enough. He came closer, not touching her, only standing near enough that his words landed straight in her chest. "They saw your face at O'Hare." Katherine went rigid, because the sentence dragged her back to the dry pop, to the threat on her phone, to the 2 men closing in that morning, and she realized her promise to leave when it was safe sounded more like self-comfort than a plan. Rafe went on, saying that when someone like Frank Moreau marked a person, he didn't need a reason to continue. He only needed a target to prove power. And she had accidentally become that target the moment she grabbed his sleeve. Katherine wanted to argue, wanted to say she could call the police, she could disappear, she could change her number, change her home, but the image of the man under the tree the night before, and the way he'd looked at her like he was pricing her, flashed back. She stood still, tears not falling, but her throat aching as if squeezed, and for the first time since Brandon had thrown her away, Katherine understood a different kind of powerlessness, that there were things you couldn't run from by closing a door and pretending you were fine, because the world she'd just stepped into was a system already in motion, and in that system, the idea of safety had never existed the way she'd always believed. The room still carried the icy scent of what had just happened, even though the man had been dragged out of sight, and Katherine stood frozen like a statue in the living room, her heart still pounding from a moral shock with nowhere to go. Rafe didn't apologize. He didn't offer a long justification. He only signaled for everyone to disperse, as if the most important thing now was to return a little normalcy to the space, so she wouldn't shatter on the spot. When only the 2 of them remained, he poured a glass of water and set it on the table in front of her, not forcing, not coaxing, simply placing it there like something a body might need. Then he sat across from her, far enough away not to feel like a threat, but with eyes that still seemed to lock the situation in place. Katherine didn't drink. She stared at the water as if it were a question. At last her voice came out hoarse and thin. "What do you want me to do now?" Rafe was silent for a beat, and Katherine hated that silence, because it felt exactly like the silences Brandon used before throwing an insult at her. But with Rafe, the silence didn't carry pleasure. It carried calculation. He said that if she hid in this house, she would live, but she would live like a shadow, and his people would have to stretch themselves thin, protecting someone who didn't belong to them, while the enemy used her very existence to knock on the door day after day. Katherine wanted to laugh bitterly, because she'd never asked to be a burden. But the truth was she was here because she had nowhere else to go. Rafe leaned forward, his voice slower now, as if offering an option rather than issuing an order, and said they needed a public cover. Katherine frowned, not understanding. He explained that Frank Moreau didn't shoot only to kill, he shot to send a message, and the strongest message was always showing who belonged to whom, who was protected by whom, and who would pay for touching them. If Katherine was seen beside him, not as a victim hidden away, but as someone he had chosen, that would tie the hands of certain predators circling close, and it would also force the informants to move, because they would have to report to the right person at the right time. Katherine heard the words "been chosen," and her throat tightened, not with gratitude, but with fear, because she was terrified of being defined by someone again. She looked at Rafe, her voice hard. "You want me to be your good luck charm?" Rafe didn't blink. He said he wanted to use her presence like a mirror, so the enemy would see they'd expose themselves, and so his people would understand she wasn't an easy target to erase. Katherine let out a dry laugh, the sound like glass rubbing against glass. She said plainly that she wasn't a doll for him to display in front of others. She wasn't an accessory for his war, and she absolutely wouldn't accept having her life controlled like being locked inside a pretty cage. Rafe stayed still and let her finish, and that alone surprised her, because she was used to men cutting her off, using a louder voice to win. When Katherine paused to breathe, Rafe said she had the right to refuse, but she also needed to understand the consequences, that Moreau wouldn't stop until he had something he could brag about, proof that he could touch Calder without punishment. Katherine swallowed hard, the image of the bullet embedded behind her, where she'd stood, flaring in her mind like a red exclamation point. She drew a deep breath, forced herself back from the edge of panic. then spoke slowly, as if writing a contract for her own life. If she agreed to any kind of cover, she needed clear boundaries. She didn't want her phone inspected like she was a criminal. She didn't want to be watched step for step like a prisoner. She didn't want him deciding where she went, who she saw, what she said, and above all, she wouldn't accept being pushed into intimacy to perform for other people. She needed to know the real level of danger, not vague words, and she needed the right to say no at any time if she felt she was being pushed past her limits. The last sentence came down like a blade on the table. She'd been in a relationship where her no had no value, and she wouldn't live that again, no matter who the man across from her was. Rafe watched her for a long time. His eyes didn't soften in a flattering way, but something like quiet respect appeared, as if she'd passed a test he'd never named out loud. He nodded once, slow and final, and said she would have the boundaries she wanted. He wasn't controlling her, he was protecting her, and if protection required restrictions, he would give her the reason before he acted. As for intimacy, he said he didn't need to perform something he didn't have, and he had no need to force a frightened woman to hold him in front of others. Hearing that made Katherine's chest tighten in a strange way, because it didn't match the brutality she'd just witnessed, and it didn't match the story in her head of a Mafia boss who only knew how to command. Rafe stood, went to a drawer, opened it, and took out a thin leather cord with a small metal piece, not glittering, not showy, only a simple symbol pressed into it. He set it in Katherine's palm, not keeping contact with her skin any longer than necessary, and said it wasn't jewelry. It was a signal. Anyone in his world who saw it would understand she was off limits, not because she was property, but because she was protected. Katherine looked at the small thing and felt both insulted and sheltered at once, the two emotions pulling like a tug of war. She asked if she wore it. What did she have to do? Rafe said she only had to stand beside him when needed, appear at the right time and place, and not disappear beyond his reach. Because if she vanished, the enemy would treat it as an opening, and his people would bleed to find her. Katherine wanted to say she hated anyone deciding what his reach meant for her, but then she remembered the threat on her phone, the strange hand on her elbow that morning, the way Jace had pulled her free in a single beat, as if her life were only one move on a board. She tightened her grip on the cord, feeling the cold edge of the metal bite into her skin like a reminder this wasn't a romance film. It was a survival agreement. Katherine didn't say yes in a clear word, but she slipped it over her head, letting the metal rest hidden beneath her shirt like a secret. Rafe saw it. He didn't smile. He didn't claim victory. He only said, briefly, that tonight he would give her the schedule and the risks she needed to understand, exactly as her conditions required. Katherine nodded, and in that moment she began to see Rafe as a man who kept his word, who listened to boundaries. But the deepest part of her still recoiled, still stayed wary, because she'd once believed a man when he said he wouldn't leave her, and she'd paid for that belief with nights of silent crying in an apartment that smelled like laundry powder. That night, Katherine didn't sleep deeply, not because she feared the darkness of a strange room anymore, but because she felt as if she'd signed an agreement with her own heartbeat, and each time her fingers brushed the cold metal under her shirt, she wondered whether the boundaries Rafe had just promised to keep could truly exist when bullets had flown at O'Hare. The next morning, he didn't appear right away, but everything in the house ran like a machine. People came and went without wasting words. Jace handed her a simple dark coat and told her to wear the hood if she went outside, then said that today she had to go with them for a short time, not to show off, but to set their footing again. Katherine wanted to ask more, but Jace's eyes reminded her that in this place, the more questions you asked, the more you revealed weakness, and she'd learned that in this system, weakness was leverage other people used. The car took them out of the neighborhood and onto roads that gradually turned into yards of warehouses and containers, where the smell of engine oil mixed with the cold scent of river water, and when the port rose up like a city made of steel, Katherine understood why Rafe spoke of territory the way he spoke of life and death. Containers were stacked high like fortress walls. Cranes loomed like giant arms. Between them, men in forklifts moved to a rhythm that never stopped. Rafe got out first, and he didn't need to look around for long. He just stood there for a beat, and the eyes in the area shifted on their own, like the wind changing direction. Katherine stepped after him, her heart punching hard, forcing her shoulders not to draw in, forcing her feet into the calmest pace she could pretend, and she felt the weight of being seen when unfamiliar men paused their work for 1 second too long, when a few phones were tucked neatly into palms, when curiosity mixed with fear and thickened the air. Rafe didn't hold her hand. He simply walked slightly ahead and off to the side, enough that anyone watching would understand she stood in a protected position. And Katherine realized he was keeping her condition in his own way. No public intimacy, only placing her inside a safer orbit. But at the edge of that orbit there was another gaze, sharper, more patient, not belonging to Rafe's people. On a truck parked farther off, a woman in a plain jacket with her hair tied back held a paper cup of coffee like a morning shift worker, leaning as she watched them with just enough indifference to avoid attention. Katherine only glanced once, but her instinct, the same instinct that had warned her Brandon was lying before he even tried to smile, told her the woman wasn't indifferent at all. She was measuring. The woman flicked her eyes down to a watch, then up to a phone screen, then back to Rafe, as if recording the very breathing of this territory. When Rafe went into a warehouse building, Jace kept Katherine back, in a spot hidden enough not to interfere, and that simple moment of waiting made her feel like a piece on a board again, even though she'd fought for boundaries. She turned to find that strange gaze again, and the woman was gone from where she'd been, as if she'd never existed at all, leaving only a cold sensation at the back of Katherine's neck. Along another lane of the port, that same woman stepped into an unmarked car carrying a folder with creased edges, and only after the door shut did she exhale, like someone who'd been swimming in cold water. There was no name on the tag hanging from the rearview mirror, but in her jacket pocket she kept a badge put away, and in her mind she carried a name that had haunted her for 1 year. Frank Moreau. Detective Aaron Walsh hadn't come here out of curiosity about Calder, and she hadn't come to play the hero who arrests the Mafia in the middle of a port, because she'd learned that lesson in blood. 1 year earlier, her partner, Liam, had died in an accident that was too clean. A patrol car slid off the road on a rainy night. An intersection camera lost signal at exactly the right time. The forensic report blamed slick pavement with the cheap apology of a conclusion. Aaron had seen the precise cut on the brake line in the scene photos before it was replaced, and she'd heard a drunk man let the name Moreau slip in a bar. Then the next morning that man disappeared. Aaron had followed Moreau since then, like chasing a ghost, but each time she got a hand on a link, that link was severed by a fire, an accident, a witness changing their story, and the legal system, for all its size, revealed gaps wide enough for someone like Moreau to slip through. Aaron didn't lack resolve. She lacked evidence. She also knew that if she rushed at Calder simply to cleanse the city, she'd only buy Moreau time, because when two crews collided, the smartest predator was the one who stood back, watched, and collected bodies afterward. Aaron needed Moreau to show his face. She needed him impatient. She needed him to make a mistake. And this morning a new variable had appeared like a spark dropped into a barrel of gasoline. The woman beside Rafe had an unfamiliar face. Her posture still looked unseasoned. Her eyes tried to stay hard, but a fracture showed through, and on her neck was a small signal that people in that world would recognize. Aaron saw the bait, and in her mind she built a line of cause and effect, that Moreau had fired at O'Hare, not because he wanted to kill that woman, but because he wanted to touch Rafe in the most public place possible, to prove he dared. And if that woman kept appearing beside Rafe, Moreau wouldn't be able to stand being challenged in full view. He'd push harder. He'd take bigger risks, and those risks would create the evidence Aaron needed. Aaron sat in her car and opened Liam's file, her finger resting on the photograph of the cut brake edge. Then she looked out at the port where containers still moved like the heartbeat of the city, and she reminded herself of the single most important thing, that she couldn't let emotion take the wheel. She wasn't on Calder's side, but she also wasn't foolish enough to believe she could crush them both with one arrest order. She was walking a wire, with the law on one side and the filthy reality of men like Moreau on the other. And in the middle was a woman named Katherine, pulled by accident into a game Aaron had to play to the end, not to save Calder, but to finally force Frank Moreau into the open. Just as Katherine was beginning to adjust to the strained rhythm of life inside the safe house, the afternoon was torn open by a phone ringing in rapid bursts and hurried footsteps in the hallway. No one raised their voice, yet the air changed color the way it does when a storm is about to break. Jace opened her door and said only one short sentence, that they had to leave now, then pressed a small bag into her hand with gauze, disinfectant, and gloves, as if they'd already prepared for the fact that she would have to see blood. Katherine froze and asked what was happening, but behind Jace, Rafe appeared, his face still calm, only his eyes dropping a shade darker, and he said their warehouse was on fire. The words turned Katherine cold, not because she cared about Mafia inventory, but because inside the word warehouse, she heard something larger than money. She heard the backbone of territory, a place where people worked, a place where someone could be trapped if flames spread. The car surged forward. The city fell back like a strip of film, and the closer they got to the industrial district, the sharper the burned smell became, as if someone were setting the air itself on fire. When they turned onto the road leading to the warehouse, Katherine saw a pillar of black smoke rising thick as a wall. Flames licked along the corrugated roof. Orange light reflected in dirty puddles on the pavement. Fire truck sirens screamed, mixing with people shouting and metal groaning. Rafe got out first. He didn't run wild. He issued short commands to his people to spread out, cut power, pull extinguishers, clear a path for the fire engines. And Katherine was stunned that in the middle of this chaos, everyone still listened to him as if following a drumbeat. She stayed behind him, heart hammering, gloves already on, and though she told herself this wasn't her life, her feet still moved toward a weak groan near the warehouse entrance, where a man lay on his side with one arm clutched to his body, his face pale as paper. Katherine dropped to her knees and forgot she was in Mafia territory. She remembered only what her mother had taught her when she was little, that if you see someone hurt, don't stare. Do something. She cut his jacket open to expose the burn, sprayed disinfectant, wrapped it fast, her mouth asking his name, asking if anyone was still inside. The man sobbed and pointed, saying 2 people were in the back. The side door was jammed. Katherine looked up at Rafe, and for the first time, she saw something like real worry flash across his face, fast and tightly contained. Then he turned to Jace, signaled, and the 2 of them lunged toward the side door like running into forbidden ground. Katherine tried to follow, but someone held her back, and she stood there with her hands carrying the burned smell, hearing wood crack, glass shatter, and water blasting in a roar like manufactured rain. In the crowd she saw faces tight, not only because of fire, but because they understood this was a declaration of war, a strike against reputation, because a warehouse burning didn't just mean lost goods. It meant losing the image that Calder controlled his territory. When the firefighters drove hoses deeper inside, a shifting wind shoved smoke toward Katherine, and she coughed hard, eyes burning. And in that same moment, she heard someone behind her speak very softly. Moreau did it. The name Frank Moreau slid through her like a cold blade, and she thought of Aaron Walsh somewhere out there, watching everything like a chessboard. She remembered Rafe saying Moreau didn't bluff. Rafe turned back, his shirt already smeared with grime, but his posture still straight, and when he stepped across half-burned stacks of crates, people split automatically to make space, as if he were the only one allowed to walk into the center of the storm. Katherine followed, pulled by an instinct she couldn't name, the sense that something more important than fire was waiting inside. As they neared a small office area on the side of the warehouse, the flames reflected off shattered glass and made the world look like a trembling screen. And then Katherine saw it before Rafe could even stop, an object dangling from a charred doorframe, not hung to be saved, but hung to be seen. It was an old badge, or a small shield-shaped metal emblem, engraved with the letter M, and a deep scratch as if someone had carved it on purpose, suspended on a thin wire, cold in the heat, like a hunter's tooth displayed as a trophy. Beneath it hung a plastic photo stained with smoke, the outlines still visible. A middle-aged man standing beside a younger man, both in worksite clothes, and in the corner of the photo a line of handwriting in smeared red ink, the letters scrawled like claws. Remember, Calder. Katherine didn't understand all of it, but she saw Rafe stop for a single beat, and in that beat, the calm on his face looked like thin ice being tapped. He didn't shout, he didn't break anything. He only reached up, pulled the photo down, and stared at it for more than a second, and Katherine felt the air around him change, as if an old door inside him had been forced open. Jace stepped in, eyes sharp, and said quietly that it was a picture of Rafe's father, and the other man was Moreau when he was younger. Back when he'd been driven out of territory after a dirty deal, when Rafe's father had made him kneel and beg, had humiliated him in front of his own men. Katherine's spine went cold, because she understood this wasn't about burning a warehouse to cause financial loss anymore. This was dragging the past out of the grave and smearing it across Rafe's face in the middle of fire. A reminder that every humiliation comes back to collect. Rafe folded the photo with careful hands, careful in a way that was frightening, as if sheathing a blade, then handed the emblem back to Jace and spoke in a calm that felt unnatural. Clear the scene, save people first, and find the person who opened a door for Moreau to crawl through. Katherine looked at him and wanted to believe he still had control, but his eyes were no longer the eyes of a man defending territory. They were the eyes of a man whose family shame had just been touched, something deeper than money and power. When they moved away from the warehouse, Katherine was still kneeling beside another injured worker, bandaging a gash on his forehead, her hands shaking from exhaustion and smoke. But what made her tremble most was realizing the war had just changed its name in a single moment. It was no longer business. It was no longer cold territory arithmetic. It had become personal, and personal vendettas always demanded more blood than numbers on paper. After the warehouse fire, the smell of smoke clung to Katherine's hair and clothes like a reminder that refused to leave, even though she'd showered twice and scrubbed until her skin turned red. And every time she closed her eyes, she still saw the column of flame rising like a wall, and the smoke-stained photo hanging on the scorched frame like an old wound dragged out in front of a crowd. Rafe didn't say much on the drive back. He handled the scene the way he handled a problem, ordering people rescued first, routes locked down, inventory checked, then disappearing into calls she couldn't hear. But Katherine could tell his calm was stretched tight as steel wire, and that made her both afraid and angry, because she didn't know where she stood inside that storm, whether she was being protected or being used as bait the way Aaron Walsh might have judged. And yet the next morning, exactly as Rafe had promised about transparency, Jace took her to her company to pick up a few documents and tell her supervisor she needed a few days off, everything quick and contained, like a lightning visit between two chases. Katherine walked into the lobby of the building where she worked, fluorescent light, cold and white, the familiar sounds of printers and keyboards, and for a few minutes she thought she might be able to touch her old life again, the life where the biggest danger was a deadline and a nasty email. She moved quickly past reception, nodded at the security guard, but the sensation of being watched stayed on her skin, not the crude feeling of someone tailing her, more like someone measuring every step. When she slipped out the back door to take a breath of air and avoid coworkers' questions, she heard her name called in a voice so familiar it cut across her breathing. Katherine. She turned, and her heart clenched hard. Brandon was standing there, his ego clearly bruised after seeing her in the arms of a powerful man at O'Hare. He hadn't come for a casual chat. He was there because he couldn't stand the thought of Katherine moving on to someone more dangerous and influential than himself. His glossy fiancée wasn't beside him, but the smugness still hung at the corner of his mouth like a habit. Katherine went still, her hand drifting to the metal piece beneath her shirt, feeling it cold and heavy, and she reminded herself she wasn't the woman who collapsed onto her bed because of him anymore. Brandon stepped closer by one pace and lifted both hands as if to prove he'd come in peace. He just wanted to talk, okay? Katherine didn't move forward or back. Her voice was dry but clear. You don't have the right to show up here. Brandon sighed as if he were the wronged one, his eyes sliding over her from head to toe, then pausing for a beat too long at her collar where the thin leather cord could show if she shifted. You look different now, he said, sounding like a compliment but also like confirmation of something. Katherine didn't answer. She only held his gaze. Brandon changed tone, softer, pretending regret, saying he'd been thinking a lot, that he'd been wrong, that he shouldn't have said those cruel words that day. He told it like an ordinary breakup story, that success had gone to his head, that he'd been pulled into a new world, that he'd been afraid of being dragged back. Katherine listened and smelled the familiar stench of lies, the stench of a man who apologized because he wanted control back, not because he truly hurt. She cut him off and said a late apology didn't heal a wound, and what they had was over. Brandon gave a small laugh, and his eyes darkened a shade. You're saying that because you've got someone new now, aren't you? Katherine felt blood rush to her ears, not from shame, but from anger, because he still thought her life revolved around men. She told him her life didn't need his approval, and she didn't owe him an explanation. Brandon shook his head as if she were a child. Then he leaned in closer, his voice dropping, and Katherine heard something slick in it, something oily, a tone he used only when he wanted to plant poison. Brandon stepped closer, slipping into a smug, oily tone. He couldn't resist the urge to show her that he still held the upper hand, asking if she truly thought O'Hare was just a coincidence. At exactly the right moment, I was there, and at exactly the right moment, something happened. He whispered with a chilling satisfaction, unaware that his own arrogance was leaving a trail of breadcrumbs straight back to Moreau. Katherine kept her face steady, but inside it was as if every wire had been pulled tight. She wanted to shout and demand what he was talking about, but she remembered the way Rafe had pressed her for details about the shooter, remembered him saying she was a variable, remembered the burning warehouse and the smoke-stained photo carrying a personal vendetta. If it was all connected, then Brandon was licking at a secret that could kill. Katherine asked, forcing her voice into calm. "What do you know?" Brandon smiled, his eyes flicking toward the road as if afraid someone might hear. "I don't know much," he said, but his "I don't know much" tasted like bragging. "I only know someone is very interested in your schedule. Someone wanted to make sure you would be there." Katherine felt sweat gather in her palm, but she didn't let it show. She asked again, "Who?" Brandon's mouth tilted, as if savoring how easily he could twist her. "Some things you shouldn't ask, Katherine. Your world is different now." The words "your world" made her skin prickle, because he said it as if he understood the world she'd been dragged into by bullets. Brandon took another half step, close enough for her to see the fine lines at the corner of his eyes, close enough to catch the jealousy under his polished manners. "See," he said, "you always need to cling to someone. First it was me, now it's him." Something inside Katherine went suddenly calm, as if part of her had burned down with the warehouse the night before. She looked at Brandon and said slowly that he was wrong. She didn't cling to anyone. She clung to her own life, and if he had any conscience left, he should stay away. Brandon laughed, but the sound wasn't happy anymore. "Don't think he'll keep you," he muttered. Then, as if remembering he was still acting regret, he softened again and said he was only worried for her. He only wanted to warn her. Katherine didn't answer a warning like that. She only stored it away. Every word he'd used. Magical, schedule, someone wanted to make sure, different world, because those weren't the words of a man who was only jealous. They were the words of someone who'd heard someone else talk about a plan. Katherine turned and went back into the building, not running, but each step felt like a knock against stone. And as she walked, she sensed, clearly, that someone was watching from far away. Not Brandon, but another pair of eyes, invisible like a camera locked on a corner. When the door shut behind her, her heart finally began to hammer again, and she understood that the small story of her morning had ended with one cold suspicion, that someone had pushed her life into the collision point at O'Hare on purpose, and Brandon, the man she thought was only cheap history, knew more than he had any right to know. Katherine left the office building with the bitter taste of the encounter with Brandon still clinging to her throat. And the most frightening part wasn't his jealousy, but the way he talked about O'Hare like a board already set for play. On the drive back to the safe house, she sat silent, eyes on the road while her mind spun, and when the front door shut behind her, she didn't throw herself onto a bed like someone trying to hide. She threw herself at the truth, like someone trying to live. She opened her old laptop, the one Jace had given a quick check and allowed within limits, and she began digging through work emails, meeting calendars, message threads with the administrative office, every small line and every timestamp. She remembered clearly that the business trip had been scheduled to fly earlier, then moved into a different time slot at the last minute for a reason that had sounded harmless. A partner meeting rescheduled. At the time, she'd only been annoyed about changing clothes and rushing, but now, looking back, it felt like an invisible hand had turned the clock, so she would be standing in the right place at O'Hare at the exact moment Brandon walked up and the gunshot cracked. Katherine found the rescheduling email with an updated file attached, sent from a familiar internal address. But when she clicked into the details, she saw something off rhythm. That message had been forwarded through an intermediary account before it reached her inbox. And that intermediary account did not belong to the administrative office. She swallowed hard, took screenshots, documented it, then texted Jace on the one-time phone that she had evidence the schedule had been tampered with and she needed to see Rafe immediately. Less than a few minutes later, Jace appeared, his eyes sharp as if he'd just been pulled out of a tense meeting. And when Katherine showed him the screen, he didn't ask how she'd gotten it. He only gave a small nod, as if she was finally speaking the language of this war, the language of traces. Rafe arrived after, dark shirt, sleeves rolled, his calm as flat as water. But Katherine could see something churning beneath it. She told him about the encounter with Brandon, every word Brandon had said, then showed the email chain, the intermediary point, and pressed the one truth she'd reached with cold instinct, that someone hadn't only known she would be at the airport. They had made sure she would be at the airport on time. Rafe didn't praise her. He didn't soothe her. He only asked for the names of people who had the right to touch her schedule, and Katherine answered that beyond the administrative office. Only Brandon knew details of the original trip, because when they were together she'd mentioned it the way you mention ordinary life. And recently he'd been building new business connections. Connections that could buy an email forward. Rafe looked at Katherine for a beat longer than necessary, then said one short sentence like a stamp. Brandon will be invited in. Katherine barely had time to ask what kind of invitation before a knock sounded at the front door. Not urgent, not polite, simply solid, like something already arranged. Jace went to open it, and Brandon stepped into the safe house as if stepping onto a stage he believed belonged to him. His face a little pale, but his smile still trying to hold, like a man who thought he'd come to negotiate. Katherine stood, her heart pounding, but she wasn't trembling the way she once had, because she'd seen a warehouse burn. She'd seen how violence could be clean and cold, and she understood this was no longer a conversation between two people who had once loved each other. This was a confrontation with a man who had sold someone else's life. Rafe didn't circle the point. He set a printed copy of the email chain in front of Brandon and asked flatly who had paid him to adjust the schedule. Brandon looked at the paper, his eyes darting fast, then let out a brittle laugh and tried to use the same confident tone he'd used on Katherine in the past, saying he didn't know what they were talking about, that he'd only stopped by her company to warn her, that he had nothing to do with it. Katherine watched his hands. His index finger tapped against his thigh, a rhythm that kept slipping, the rhythm of someone afraid. Rafe didn't need threats. He only said the name Frank Moreau, and the name struck like an invisible slap, making Brandon flinch in a beat too clear to deny. Katherine blinked, and in that instant, she knew. Brandon tried to pull his expression back into place, but it was too late, because his eyes had shown recognition. Rafe leaned in slightly, his voice still calm, and asked what Brandon had traded for the information, money or opportunity. Brandon swallowed, and as if shoved to the edge of a cliff, he spilled half a truth in the hope of mercy, saying he'd only handed over the schedule and basic details. Her name, the flight, the exits, that he hadn't thought they would shoot inside the airport, that Moreau had only promised to rattle Calder and give him a business deal, a chance to level up. Katherine heard the words level up, and her insides went cold, because that was the same thing he'd thrown in her face, that he deserved a higher life, and now he was using her life as a rung on his climb. She wanted to lunge and slap him, but her feet felt nailed to the floor, because at that exact moment, Jace's phone rang, sharp as an alarm. He listened for only a few seconds, before his face changed. He looked at Rafe, and said the police were hitting their other warehouse at the port. There was a federal team, there was a warrant, and they were saying they'd found contraband marked with Calder's sign. Katherine felt the air in the room cinch tight like a noose, because if contraband really carried Calder's mark, that wasn't just an arrest. It was a legal trap meant to erase Rafe's entire system, to turn him into a legitimate target for every gun and every prison cell to aim at. Rafe stayed still for one beat, his eyes darkening, and Katherine understood he was being forced into a choice no one wanted: either rush to the warehouse to save people and clean up the fallout, or stay to hold Katherine, because Moreau would exploit the moment he was distracted. Rafe looked at Katherine, and even without words, she heard the most ruthless question in his silence. What will I lose first? Katherine opened her mouth to say she was fine. She could stay. But in that moment, the electricity in the house flickered once, like someone had just bitten into a wire, and the sound of glass breaking snapped behind them, not loud like the fire, only sharp and dry, enough to drop Katherine's heart straight into her stomach. Jace spun, drew his gun. Rafe's men surged toward the sound, but everything happened faster than reflex. A wave of burning smoke drove into the hallway, her eyes searing, her throat locking, and in the dizzy blur she saw only a dark shape, closing in from a side door that should have been locked, a hand clamping over her mouth, the smell of rough fabric and chemicals slamming into her. Katherine fought, tried to bite, tried to fling her hands toward the leather cord beneath her shirt like it could become a lifeline, but her body grew heavy as lead. Rafe's voice calling her name sounded farther and farther away, as if from the bottom of water. She heard footsteps crashing, doors pounding, curses hissed through teeth, and then everything sank into thick black. As Katherine's awareness fell, the last thing she managed to think, cold and clear, was that this was the real abduction now. No more gentle pressure on the street, no more choices to steal, and she was disappearing off the radar at the exact moment Rafe was being pulled toward a federal trap, as if Moreau had timed the strike to break them both at once. Katherine woke into a cold that didn't belong to weather, but to metal and concrete. The kind of cold that seeped into bone as if the room had been built to keep fear alive longer than a person. Her eyes burned from smoke. Her throat was dry and raw. Her wrists were zip-tied behind her back so tight they had gone numb. There was a faint metallic taste in her mouth, as if she'd bitten her own lip while fighting. Above her, the light flickered, an old fluorescent tube trembling, throwing a steady buzzing that made time sound like a machine. She didn't know where she was, but the smell of engine oil and damp wood told her this was some kind of warehouse, and the sound of water dripping somewhere said there was a leak nearby, a pipe or a roof that didn't hold. In the first seconds, panic rose like surf. She wanted to jerk, to scream, to call Rafe's name, but a part of her, the part that had learned to survive nights abandoned with a broken heart, tightened her throat and whispered one brutal, useful truth. Fear will kill you faster than they will. Katherine forced herself to breathe slowly and count the beats, to feel the plastic bite of the tie against her skin so she could measure how much space remained. And then she began to look, not for vague hope, but like someone drawing a map. In front of her was a metal door with a small glass window. Outside was darker than inside, which meant the hallway lights weren't kept on continuously. In the upper left corner near the ceiling there was a camera, but the red indicator light was off, either cut or powerless, or only a shell meant to threaten. On the wall, there was an electrical box with its cover open, wires hanging as if someone had worked on it, and beneath it, a thin black streak, like a burn mark, proof someone had used something to kill the system before locking her in. The concrete floor carried fresh wheel tracks dragged across it, not dusted over, which meant the place was still in use, not a fully abandoned building. Katherine tilted her head and listened. She heard footsteps at intervals, steady, each burst of sound followed by a few minutes of silence, like a guard pattern. She locked that rhythm into her mind, measuring time by the fluorescent buzz, by the drip of water, because her watch was gone. The door flew open without warning, making Katherine flinch hard, but she held it back. She couldn't retreat, so she tightened her core and lifted her chin. 2 men stepped in, one thin with dead fish eyes, the other larger, smelling of cigarettes and damp outerwear. They didn't ask how she was. They asked straight about Calder, about the port warehouse, about shipment routes, contacts, about the signal under her shirt, as if they were sure she knew everything, simply because she'd stood beside Rafe. Katherine let out a hoarse laugh at the absurdity and said she didn't know, she was just someone dragged into this. But the slap came fast and hot, snapping her head to the side, ringing her ears, making the light above her jitter. The thin man leaned close to her face, his voice sweet as honey while his eyes stayed hollow, telling her not to play the victim, telling her that being beside Calder meant she had value, and that value could be traded for peace if she cooperated. Katherine tasted blood at the corner of her mouth, and in that moment she saw it clearly. They didn't want truth. They wanted something usable, a statement, a code, or even just a nod to complete a story they'd already built. She shook her head, forced her voice not to break, and said she had nothing to give. The bigger man kicked the chair leg, jolting her whole body, then warned that if she didn't talk, they would make her listen later. When they left, the door shut with the dry sound of metal meeting metal, and Katherine sat there breathing hard, tears heating behind her eyes but not falling, because she knew if she cried, she'd lose strength. She rolled her wrists inside the zip tie, searching for an edge, trying to create friction, then stopped, because she needed a plan, not panic. After a while, muffled conversation drifted in from the hallway. As if they believed she couldn't hear, Katherine shifted and pressed her ear toward the small window in the door, catching pieces the way you gather shards of glass. She heard the word port. She heard the word accident. She heard the phrase blame it on Calder, and then a sentence that made her skin turn colder than the concrete floor, that they would make a container explode as if by chance, people would die, the media would scream, and once Calder's mark was planted on it, the federal side would have reason to bury him. Katherine closed her eyes for a second and saw police flooding a warehouse, saw Rafe caught inside a trap, and understood that Moreau was playing a game that didn't only want territory. He wanted conviction. He wanted to break with law and blood at the same time. Katherine opened her eyes, and this time fear shifted into something else, sharper, harder. Because if she sat and waited, they would use her as the final piece, and then drop an accident on the city. She had to leave a sign. She had to give Rafe, or someone, a way to find her. She also had to give Aaron Walsh, or anyone with a working brain, a way to see this was staged. Katherine looked around again, searching for something she could turn into a message. Near the chair leg on the floor lay a small shard of metal, maybe from the electrical box, sharp as a blade. She dragged it closer with the toe of her shoe, then used it to saw hard at the zip tie on her wrist, pain flaring, but the plastic began to thin. She didn't cut it all the way through. She only weakened it enough that when she needed to, she could wrench it open. Then she bit hard into the inside of her cheek and forced blood to come, dripping it onto the floor in a thin trail toward the door. Not enough to be obvious at once, but enough that if anyone came in with a flashlight, they would notice someone had tried to leave a mark. She slipped off the cheap ring still left on her finger, the one they'd missed because they thought it worthless, and rolled it under the gap beneath the door so it would land in the hallway, a small metallic lure that could catch light. Finally, she reached forward as best she could, despite her hands being bound, and touched an old phone that had been tossed into the corner. Screen cracked, no SIM, but still holding a charge. She opened the Notes app and typed with 2 trembling fingers the bluntest words, the words you write when you're about to sink. Port, accident, frame, Calder, Moreau, then saved it under a random name, because if they noticed, they would delete it, but if they didn't, it would sit there like a bone. When Katherine straightened again, the zip tie still held, but it was weaker. A thin blood trail lay on the floor. The ring had vanished beneath the door. In her mind, the guard rhythm was recorded. She was still bound, still locked in, but for the first time since she'd been pulled into darkness, she felt she'd taken back a piece of agency, small and fragile, but enough to turn her from silent prey into someone carving a way out with her own mind. Time in the cold warehouse felt stretched out with steel wire. Katherine sat perfectly still to save strength, her eyes fixed on the door and her ears fixed on the cadence of footsteps in the hallway. She had measured the gap between patrol passes, and when that cadence suddenly shifted, no longer steady but faster and more crowded, she knew something was happening outside. Metal locks clicked twice in quick succession, not the way her kidnappers opened the door. Then came a dry, clean sound, like a body hitting a wall and being stopped before it could shout. Katherine held her breath. Her hands tightened around the zip tie she'd already worn thin, ready to wrench it open if she had to. And right then the ceiling light flickered hard once as if frightened, then steadied again, dim and cold. The door opened only a crack, not thrown wide, and a figure slipped in like a streak of dark, so fast that her eyes could register only height. Broad shoulders, movement with no waist, and then the door eased nearly shut again. Katherine saw the eyes before she heard a word, eyes calm in a way that was terrifying, and her whole chest seemed to drop and then surge. Rafe. He didn't rush in to hug her. He didn't speak softening lines. He dropped to one knee at once, used a small blade to slice through the zip tie at her wrists in a single beat, checked the red marks quickly, then set his hand under her chin and tilted her face just enough to see the bruising, his voice low and clipped. "Can you walk?" Katherine nodded, but her legs were numb, and she had to grip the chair edge to stand. Rafe handed her a dark coat, asked nothing, simply draped it over her shoulders to hide dirt and hide trembling, then signaled for her to stay tight behind him, never stepping in front. They left the room into a dark hallway where the smell of engine oil was heavier, and Katherine saw the thin blood trail she'd left still there like a message, her small ring glinting near a corner farther down, and she silently thanked herself for not giving up. But as they reached the outer door of the warehouse, a siren sounded in the distance, not a fire siren, but the kind that could summon prison, and at the same time red and blue lights swept through the cracks like blades. Rafe stopped. His expression didn't change, but Katherine felt the muscle in his jaw clamp tight. He looked to the side, and Jace appeared like another shadow, a small smear of blood on his sleeve proving there had been contact. And Jace spoke fast, saying there were cops, federal too, and if they went out now they would walk straight into the trap Moreau had laid. Katherine went cold because she heard the very word trap that had haunted her since she was taken, and right then, from the direction of the main warehouse door came the sound of a loudspeaker ordering commands, the stomp of boots on concrete, someone shouting Calder's name like summoning a demon. Rafe didn't curse. He didn't panic. He only pulled Katherine into a blind corner behind a row of wooden crates, shielding her from guns and from law at the same time. Katherine peered through a gap and saw a woman in a plain jacket step in under flashlight beams, her stride firm, her eyes sweeping like knives. Detective Erin Walsh. She wasn't there by accident, because 2 other officers behind her took positions. Yet Erin was the only one who didn't charge like she was grabbing a trophy. She stopped and studied the floor, the wheel tracks, the electrical box left open, the dead camera, as if she were reading a different story beneath the official script. Katherine knew that if Erin arrested Rafe on the spot, everything would end the way Moreau wanted. Calder in cuffs, Moreau disappearing, and the port accident becoming the final period signed with a forged name. Katherine inhaled hard, pulled Rafe closer with a brief touch, and whispered fast, as if murmuring inside a church, that this was staged. The goods and paperwork here carried the wrong mark. Rafe looked at her for 1 beat. Then he sent a glance to Jace, and Jace tossed something lightly toward the area near Erin. Not a weapon, but a small piece of plastic taken from the corner of the room where Katherine had been held. A seal fragment cut crooked. Erin bent to pick it up on professional reflex. Her eyes narrowed, and Katherine knew she had to give Erin something more specific, something that could stand up as lawful cause instead of faith in a Mafia man. Katherine stepped half a pace out of the shadow, just enough for Erin to catch her in the flashlight beam. Bruised face, coat wrapped tight, but eyes still carrying awareness. Erin jolted with surprise, then lifted the light and aimed it like she was examining a living witness. Katherine spoke quickly, her voice hoarse but clear, explaining that while she was held captive in the warehouse, she had overheard the guards arguing about the rushed and imperfect seals they were forcing onto the crates. She pointed out that these seals were cut straight with a razor, a jagged detail that stood out compared to the professional stamped impressions she often saw on her own company's high-end shipments. She added that the codes they were whispering about felt off, as the first letters didn't match the standard port routes she had memorized for her own business logistics, proving the paperwork was a hurried forgery. Erin didn't answer at once, but Katherine saw Erin's eyes change. No longer the eyes of someone here to arrest, but the eyes of someone who'd just found a crack in a wall. Erin turned to an officer behind her and said something low about seal verification and code matching, then stepped forward a little, dropping her flashlight angle so it wouldn't shine directly into the space where Rafe was hidden. A small, deliberate act. Erin spoke loud enough for others to hear that they needed to secure the scene, verify the seal, canvas cameras around the area, and no one was to rush deeper because there were signs of staging and it could be dangerous. That sentence was a legal shield for her, and it was breathing room for Rafe. Rafe looked at Erin. He didn't thank her. He didn't bargain out loud. He only gave a very slight nod, like acknowledging an unwritten deal, then pulled Katherine back into the side exit route. Erin placed herself between her team in that direction, deliberately, forcing them to follow procedure instead of hot blood, because she needed Calder alive, not to forgive him, but to keep Moreau believing the trap hadn't closed, and to make him keep showing his hand. When Rafe guided Katherine out through a side door into a dark parking area, she heard Erin say one last line that fell into the cold air. "Tonight we arrest no one. Tonight we arrest the truth." And in that moment, Katherine understood an unwilling alliance had just formed, not built on luck or kindness, but on a larger target, and a crack opened at exactly the right time when evidence spoke. The car rolled out of the warehouse lot in darkness like a wounded animal trying to stay silent. Katherine sat curled inside Rafe's coat, her hands still burning where the plastic had bitten, her head still ringing from the slap. But what stole her breath most was the silence of the man beside her. Rafe didn't ask if she was okay in a soothing way. He only checked her pulse at her wrist, looked straight into her eyes to make sure she was still alert, then turned his gaze to the windshield, as if every feeling had been locked behind a steel door. Jace drove without speaking, and the other vehicles behind them kept distance like a formation practiced 100 times. When they reached the safe house, Katherine had barely crossed the threshold before her legs gave, not from weakness, but because her body had held itself tight for too long. She sank into a chair and took short breaths. She thought they'd treat her injuries, seal the security, let her sleep. But Rafe's footsteps hit the hallway, decisive and cold, like a hammer striking a verdict. He stepped into the living room where his people had gathered, a few faces smeared with grime, eyes red with strain, and Rafe gave the order at once, voice low but hard as stone, that they would hit back tonight, not wait until morning, not give Moreau one more hour to breathe. Katherine flinched and looked at him. She saw in his eyes a black flame newly lit. Not a reckless flame, but the kind born of old memory dragged out of a grave. The same flame she'd seen when he stared at the photo of his father in the burned warehouse. Jace reported quickly that they'd identified a location tied to the link that had taken Katherine, a small warehouse at the river's edge with traffic in and out, maybe a transfer point, and Rafe said immediately they were going there, taking people, taking information, then burning it clean. Katherine heard the word burn, and her insides tightened, because she'd just watched a warehouse blaze, and she'd just seen skin blistered by fire, and she couldn't bear another night of flames. But what made her stand wasn't the word burn. It was what Rafe said next, that if needed, they would drag the hired hands inside out as hostages to force Moreau into the open, because only when Moreau hurt where he believed he was safe would he crawl out. The room went silent for a beat. A few men glanced at each other as if they, too, knew that line was thin, and Katherine understood it had crossed the boundary she'd demanded. Don't touch the innocent. She stepped forward, eyes still stinging, voice hoarse but clear, and asked Rafe what he was talking about. Rafe turned. This time his gaze wasn't merely cold, it was sharp and dark, as if anyone who blocked him would be cut. He said she didn't understand, that Moreau had no innocence, that everything he touched became a weapon, and if they stayed soft, they died. Katherine shook her head, fear turning into anger, because she'd been taken, hit, locked away, and she was still standing here trying to hold on to one piece of moral ground, while he was preparing to tear it up and replace it with smoke. She told him plainly that she could understand wanting revenge. She could understand wanting to protect his territory and his people. But pulling hired workers or people with nothing to do with this into the fire as bait was turning them into her, using their terror as a tool, and that wasn't protection. That was becoming Moreau in another version. Rafe let out a dry laugh and said she was still thinking like a normal person, that war had no room for ideals. Katherine took one more step, close enough that he couldn't miss the bruise on her cheek, close enough that he had to remember why he'd gone feral in the first place. She spoke slowly, each word hammered in, saying she'd just come back from a cold room where men asked her about Calder like she was merchandise, that she'd heard their plan for a port accident to pin on him, that Moreau wanted him to lose his mind so he would burn himself down, and if he charged into revenge by stepping on the innocent, he would hand Moreau exactly what he needed. Rafe didn't answer right away, but Katherine saw a small twitch at the corner of his eye, like an old wound touched. She kept going, her voice no longer shaking with fear but with determination to guard the last boundary she had, saying she'd once lived with a man who used love to control and used promises to bind, and she'd escaped that with blood in her heart, and she would not walk into a new prison just because this one had thicker walls and better guards. She looked straight at him and delivered the last line like a bright blade in a dark room, that if he became what he hated, if he started using innocent people as tools just to feel strong, she would leave, even if it was dangerous, even if she had to run through the night, because she'd rather die as herself than live beside a monster she had to justify every day. The room was full of people, and yet utterly silent, and in that silence Katherine heard Rafe's breathing change rhythm, as if he'd been slapped by the truth. He stared at her long enough that she thought he would order someone to drag her out, but then his gaze dropped by a fraction, not into weakness, but like a man realizing his hands were gripping too hard, the very thing he feared losing. He stepped closer, didn't touch her, only stood in front of her, his voice lower now, less sharp, and asked what she thought he was doing. Katherine swallowed and said he was using violence to prop up fear. Fear of Moreau stripping his authority. Fear his people would die, and the deepest fear of all, fear of losing her after he'd just pulled her out of the dark. Rafe closed his eyes for one beat, and in that beat, the steel on his face cracked by a thin line, just enough to show the pain he kept buried. He turned to his people and lowered his voice with new orders. No hostage plan, no burning. Take information clean, evidence, bills of lading, cameras, money trails, and force Moreau into the open with what he couldn't erase. Jace looked at him, slightly surprised, then nodded, like someone who'd just watched his leader choose a harder road and a brighter one. Katherine let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding, and when Rafe looked back at her, his eyes were still dark, still dangerous, but something new had appeared, an unspoken admission that she had pulled him back from the edge. The small story closed on a choice, not an easy one, but the choice of a man deciding to win with proof instead of slaughter. And Katherine understood that from this moment on, the fight wasn't only against Moreau, it was against the darkness inside Rafe himself. After the night Rafe gave the order to stop, things didn't soften the way Katherine expected. They only changed shape, from gunfire and smoke into nonstop calls, closed-door meetings, Territory maps spread across the table like flesh being opened, and faces coming and going through the safe house carrying a tension heavier than engine oil. Rafe kept his word to her in the most practical way. He didn't pull her into dirty actions. He didn't use her like a charm in front of crowds. But that same faithfulness came with something else that ached under her skin, that he disappeared into strategy so completely that she saw only his back and heard only his footsteps in the hallway at midnight. Katherine sat in the corner of the living room with a glass of water gone lukewarm, watching Jace and a few others hunched over laptops, hearing words like bills of lading, shipping routes, cameras, money trails, as if listening to a language she hadn't had time to learn before she was forced to live inside it. And even though Rafe had chosen evidence instead of slaughter, the war still herded them into an invisible cage where every sound outside the door could make her heart jump. The bruise on her cheek faded, but the sensation of being bound stayed in her wrists like a ghost. And when Rafe stayed silent too long, old whispers returned, telling her she was fighting alone, telling her she was only a temporary variable, telling her that one day he would return to his life, and she would stand at the edge like someone extra. She hated herself for thinking that after everything he'd done to save her. But she hated even more the feeling of being trapped in this house without knowing who she was tomorrow. Witness, hostage, or a woman beginning to care about a man who didn't belong in her life. One afternoon, when Jace took another alarm call, and everyone moved toward the meeting room as if a string had been pulled, Katherine stood as if hypnotized, put on a coat, pulled on a hat, and went out the back door before anyone could stop her. She wasn't running from Rafe and betrayal. She only needed a patch of sky to breathe under, without hearing metal inside her head. The guard at the door glanced at her, noticed the corded signal beneath her collar, and opened the door in silence, as if in this system, her right to exist had been purchased with supervision. Katherine walked a few blocks, trying to blend into ordinary people, living ordinary lives, people buying pastries, walking dogs, laughing, and that ordinariness choked her more than any gunshot, because it reminded her she'd lost the right to be carefree. She found the small park near her old apartment, where leafless trees stood still and the swing set creaked in the wind, the place where she'd once sat crying after Brandon left and promised herself she would live. Katherine sat on the swing, hands gripping the chains, and for the first time in days, tears fell not from physical pain, but from exhaustion. Exhausted from having to be strong without pause, exhausted from having to stay alert without rest, exhausted from knowing there was always another world aiming at her back. She lifted her face toward the gray sky and wondered if everything would feel lighter if she vanished from this board, then cursed herself for the thought because it was foolish, because Moreau had seen her, because she was no longer allowed to disappear. Footsteps on gravel pulled her out of the spiral, not fast, not urgent, but carrying a familiar weight. Katherine turned and saw Rafe a few steps away. No loud motorcade, no Jace at his shoulder, only him alone in a dark coat, wind slightly tousling his hair, and in his eyes a mix of anger and relief, like a man who has just found what he was terrified to lose. He didn't ask why she'd gone. He only said that making herself disappear in a city hunting her was the fastest way to drive him insane. Katherine gave a dry laugh and said he was already insane. He just hid it well, and she couldn't stand feeling like she was the only one afraid, while he kept vanishing into strategy, leaving her sitting here like an object stored for safekeeping. Rafe stayed still and let her speak, and when she stopped, he pulled a piece of paper from his coat pocket, folded many times, edges wrinkled, like something he'd carried longer than he needed to. He handed it to her. Katherine looked down and her chest tightened, because it was the page she'd scribbled one night in the safe house, after he asked what she wanted if she could live in peace. She'd thought it was only a burst of impulse from someone shaking, but her writing was still there. A balcony full of flowers, hot pastries on Sunday mornings, a small house not for hiding but for coming home, an old bookshelf, a kitchen with sunlight. Katherine read each line as if reading a version of herself she'd assumed had died. Rafe spoke slowly and said he wouldn't promise his life would be clean, because if he said that it would be a lie, and he didn't want to build anything with her out of lies. But he promised respect and transparency. He promised she wouldn't be kept inside his darkness like a convenient secret. He promised every decision that affected her would be spoken out loud before it happened, and he promised he would not cross the boundaries she'd set, even in anger. He looked straight at her, voice so low the wind itself seemed to slow, and said he'd lived his whole life by the old rules, his father's rules, the territory's rules, the rule that if you wanted to live you had to be harder than anyone else, and those rules had created Moreau, had created vendettas that never ended. He said he didn't need her to forgive his past. He only needed her to help him write a new set of rules from now on. Rules where victory didn't have to be paid for with innocent blood. Rules where evidence and intelligence could replace burning and killing. Rules where she wasn't a variable dragged along, but a woman choosing to stay with freedom. Katherine stared at the paper in her hand, then at the gray sky, then at the man standing in front of her. And she realized what made her feel alone wasn't that he didn't care. It was that they were both afraid, only in different ways. She feared being left behind. He feared losing her and feared losing control. She drew a deep breath, folded the paper carefully as if placing a promise back into her chest, then told him that if they struck back, they would strike with minds, not blood. And if he wanted her to stay, he had to give her the right to know and the right to say no, not once, but every day. Rafe nodded and stepped a little closer, not touching her yet, asking permission with distance. And Katherine rose from the swing so they stood facing each other in her old neighborhood park, standing on the line between two worlds. The small story closed on an agreement with no ring and no poetic vows, only a wrinkled page of dreams and a clear decision that together they would write new rules and hit Moreau with the one thing he couldn't erase easily: the truth. When Katherine and Rafe returned from the old neighborhood park, the air inside the safe house was no longer just tense. It had shifted into a cold, surgical focus. Because everyone understood Moreau would not stop after the failed abduction and the federal trap Aaron had slowed down. He would change tactics, and his tactics always meant cutting into the weakest point. Rafe kept his promise of transparency. He called Katherine into the meeting room, introduced Miles as Calder's logistics lead, younger than Jace, but with eyes sharp in the way of someone who had lived too long inside dark roots, and he said plainly that if they wanted to win with truth, they had to make truth reveal itself through paperwork and movement, not through a confession squeezed out of fear. Miles spread bills of lading across the table, route maps for warehouses, truck schedules, and Katherine recognized the same machinery Moreau had been manipulating to build the port accident trap, to plant contraband marked with Calder's sign. She wasn't a logistics person, but she carried a different kind of memory, the memory of someone lied to so often she learned to hear the places where a sentence goes off beat, and she remembered exactly what she'd heard in the cold warehouse. The talk about a seal cut straight like a razor, about route codes out of sync, about splicing papers. Katherine pointed to a seal sample. Miles sat down and asked where the proper stamp impression should sit, asked how to cross-check a bill of lading code against a route, and Miles looked at her like someone who had walked into this world and still asked the right questions. Together they built a trap that smelled ordinary in the most ruthless way. A fake route created with a clean load, but paperwork deliberately seeded with one tiny wrong detail, small enough that someone on the inside would have to correct it if they wanted to stitch it into Moreau's frame, and clean enough that Aaron could prove interference. Miles prepared 2 sets of bills of lading nearly identical. One set ran through the normal route. The other was a decoy with a turn point that didn't exist, and only a person deep enough inside would see the full picture to forward it outward. Katherine proposed adding one more thing, a human bait, not just paper, that she would slip a sentence into a conversation that sounded harmless, telling someone she'd heard Rafe planned to move a rushed shipment through Route A tonight. Then they would watch where the information flowed. Rafe didn't like her being involved, but he remembered her demand for the right to know and the right to speak, so he nodded. Aaron Walsh was brought in through a sealed channel, not as a friend, but as lawful traction. She didn't step into the safe house. She only received a data package from Miles through an attorney intermediary, and she said bluntly that if they wanted her to move, they had to give her something clean enough to hold in court: logs, cameras, code comparisons, and money trails. Katherine heard the phrase money trails and thought of Brandon, the man who had sold her flight schedule the way you sell a cheap item, and she felt the circle tightening. Not a fairy tale circle, but a handcuff circle. The trap was released on an afternoon that looked ordinary. Miles left the decoy route information sitting in exactly the place an insider could touch it. Katherine deliberately walked past the warehouse office area and spoke one sentence loud enough for a man she had never met but had seen a few times, saying Rafe was moving the load through the old port route because he needed to avoid attention. Then she quietly withdrew. Everything stayed quiet for hours, quiet enough that Katherine wondered if they were imagining it. And then that night, a warehouse camera captured a man sneaking a photo of the bill of lading, sending it, then deleting history, fast but not fast enough to beat the log system Miles had planted. At the same time, Erin had her people tail a phone number that received the message, traced it to a meet point where cash was exchanged, and the grainy video still showed enough: a hand passing an envelope, a license plate, a brief flash of the receiver's face. The mole was exposed that same night without torture, only through matched data, and Rafe kept his promise against needless violence. He didn't execute the man on the spot. He only locked him down, took the phone, took the accounts, took the logs, and routed everything to Erin through legal channels so she could build a clean chain of evidence. Erin did her part with steel-cold discipline. She secured a search warrant based on the bill of lading interference logs and the cash exchange footage. She added a piece about the fake seal from the cold warehouse incident, and the picture began to form clearly enough to reach for the name Moreau without the thread being cut halfway. But the most ruthless payoff landed on Brandon, because when Erin followed the money trail, a small transfer, disguised as a consulting fee, surfaced, running through a shell company and ending in Brandon's account. And on the mole's phone, there was a chat thread that plainly mentioned buying Katherine's flight schedule and her basic information. Brandon was no longer a man dropping hints. He became a link with ink on paper. Katherine heard Erin's update through Jace, and her chest went cold, but not in the way she expected, because her feelings had been replaced by something else. Clarity. That the man who once called her a burden had sold her to someone who wanted her dead. Erin said that with this chain, she had enough to arrest Brandon as an accomplice, at least on charges tied to providing information that led to danger and receiving money, and that would cut one of Moreau's legs inside the ordinary world, making him furious and reckless. Rafe knew it, and Katherine knew it too, because when an animal is driven into a corner, it bites the softest thing to clear away, and in this game, the softest thing was always her. Late at night, when everyone believed they had won a beat, when Miles was backing up logs to a hard drive and Jace was reinforcing locks, a strange call hit the one-time line, rang for a single beat, then cut off, like a fingertip touching skin before the blade sinks in. Right after, the exterior camera system blinked black for a single second, not long enough to trigger full alarm, but long enough to make Katherine's neck prickle. Rafe stepped to the window and stared into the darkness without blinking, and he said very softly, as if speaking to himself, that Moreau knew they were tightening the noose with evidence, so he would not wait anymore. Katherine hadn't even formed a question when a message appeared on Jace's backup phone. No number, only cold words saying the witness must disappear before dawn. Katherine stood perfectly still, feeling as if the house had been touched from the outside, like a claw testing a door, and the small story closed with a truth striking straight into her chest, that the danger was no longer at the port or in some far warehouse. It was at their doorstep, and tonight's target was not cargo and not territory. It was Katherine. That night there was no thunder and no rain to warn them, only an unnatural stillness, as if the whole neighborhood was holding its breath, and Katherine felt it from the moment the hallway light flickered once and then went steady, from the way the neighbor's dog stopped barking, from the way the hair at the back of her neck lifted as if someone had just laid eyes on her spine. The safe house had reinforced its locks. Jace had tightened the rotation, heavier coverage. Rafe walked his checks corner by corner like an obsessive habit, but Moreau didn't strike where they watched. He struck in the moment. A human has to live, has to use the bathroom, has to get water, has to breathe. Katherine stepped out of the bedroom to go downstairs for a glass of water, the old marks still faint in her palms, and the instant she bent to open the cabinet, a tiny click sounded at the back door, so small an ordinary person would have blamed a vent, but Katherine wasn't ordinary anymore. She froze and listened, and in the next second the survival instinct forged in that cold warehouse snapped up like a trigger. She didn't scream. She didn't run straight for the meeting room. She stepped back once and swept the kitchen fast, looking for an exit, a live camera, something that could become a mark. The click became the soft sound of a door easing shut. Then a dark shape poured into the hallway, unhurried, unclumsy, moving like someone trained to enter a guarded house. Katherine didn't wait for orders. She snatched the backup phone from the table, hit the internal alarm button Jace had taught her, then threw the phone into the kitchen corner so the sound would pull the intruder's attention offline, and she sprinted toward the front but didn't open into the dark street, because she remembered Rafe's rule: the safest place is the place with light and eyes that can see. She chose to run into the storage bay behind the house where they kept vehicles and decoy cargo, where cameras ran continuously because Miles had used the space to verify bills of lading and routes, where motion sensors snapped on lights, and most of all, where there was cover enough to buy time. Footsteps behind her sped up. A man's voice snapped a short command, and Katherine knew it wasn't one person. She heard fabric scrape the wall, a soft metallic touch that could have been a barrel or a blade, and she understood she was being hunted for real, not threatened. Katherine shoved open the storage door. The motion light burst on in hard, cold white. A small camera in the ceiling corner blinked a red dot, and she pulled a deep breath as if gripping a lifeline. She didn't run straight across open space. She pressed tight to the line of wooden crates and used angles and blind corners, running while leaving deliberate signs the way she'd learned. Tipping an old paint can so it rolled and left a smear on the floor, yanking a tarp so it dropped with a loud slap, and most important, slamming the emergency light mounted on the pillar, the one that would record every body cutting through under its glare. A bullet punched into the wood behind her, the crack so sharp her ears rang, and Katherine nearly went down, but she didn't stop. She changed direction at once, diving into the narrow aisle between metal shelves, where footsteps would echo and cameras would catch silhouettes, where an attacker couldn't fire blindly without revealing himself. One man lunged after her, tall, wearing black gloves, and Katherine saw what made her blood turn to ice. He held a suppressed pistol, not the kind for warning, the kind for erasing. She dropped low, grabbed a short metal rod from a lower shelf, not to fight like a movie, but to do something more practical. She hurled it hard at the light switch at the far end of the aisle, making the lights stutter for a beat and throwing chaotic shadows just long enough to slow him for 1 second. 1 second was everything. Katherine slipped sideways, threaded through a tight gap between stacked crates, knocked over a tower of empty boxes, so they thundered like a storm, both to mask her breathing and to buy more time for Rafe's team. She heard the internal alarm blaring inside the house. She heard men shouting. She heard a door kicked open, and she knew they were awake now. But Moreau didn't send amateurs. He sent men who knew how to finish. The gloved attacker closed in, no longer spraying shots, moving slow and steady like a hunter using patience to press prey into a corner. Katherine scanned and spotted the exit leading toward the front parking area, where streetlights and exterior cameras would catch the open, and she chose that direction, cutting across a gap at the exact moment the sensor light flared brighter, ensuring the camera captured her face and the shadow chasing her. A hand grabbed her coat from behind and yanked hard, stealing her breath. But Katherine turned with the pull, used his own force, and drove her elbow into his wrist. Not enough to drop him, but enough to loosen his grip for half a beat. She tore free, hit the concrete floor hard, her knee burning like fire, and through the pain she still made one last deliberate move. She smeared blood from her scraped knee onto the edge of a truck's bumper, leaving a bright red mark like a directional arrow. Another shot cracked, closer now. But then came a louder burst, glass breaking, metal slamming, and a body tore into the space like a storm. Rafe. He arrived not like a pretty savior, but like lethal reflex, yanking Katherine out of the line of fire in one motion, turning to shield her with his own body, and at the same time Jace and 2 others flooded in from both sides, closing angles, forcing the attacker into a narrow pocket between a vehicle and a shelf. Under the harsh white light, Katherine saw what Moreau's signature really was, not a message, but a person. The second man who appeared at the storage entrance had a small tattoo on his neck, a symbol she'd seen in a burned photo hanging inside Calder's warehouse. And when he looked at Rafe, his eyes held a cold loyalty, not a hired gun's emptiness. Rafe saw the tattoo and his jaw tightened, and Katherine understood that was confirmation. Moreau had signed his name onto the night with his own people. The clash ended fast and clean. Not a massacre, but violent enough for someone to go down, loud enough for cameras to record, and marked enough that Aaron could understand this was no longer speculation. When the noise finally dropped away, Katherine sat with her back against a tire, breathing hard, her hands shaking, but her eyes no longer panicked, because she realized she had survived not by luck, but because she had refused to stand still and wait to die. She had chosen light, chosen cameras, chosen traces, chosen terrain, and chosen herself on a night when Moreau had meant to turn her into a name erased before morning. After the ambush night, nobody in the safe house slept in any normal sense anymore. They only took turns closing their eyes for a few minutes, then jolting upright when a radio buzzed. Katherine sat wrapping her knee, staring at the dried blood on her hand like a reminder that Moreau had reached their very door. Rafe wouldn't let her out of his sight, but this time, it wasn't the suffocating kind of control. It was the watchfulness of a man who had nearly lost what he refused to lose, and he told her plainly that the night had given them what they needed. Not only camera proof they could show, but the signature of Moreau's people, the tattoo, and the suppressed weapon that wasn't spontaneous. Enough to force Aaron to see this war as a structured plot. Miles pulled the storage bay footage off the system onto a hard drive, time-locked it, digitally signed it, and backed it up in 3 copies, and Katherine realized they were doing the opposite of what Mafia stories usually do. They were building a case like prosecutors. Aaron Walsh didn't call to check on anyone. She called to demand what was clean: the video segments, the door access logs, the seal comparison, the decoy route, and especially the money trail from the mole to Moreau. Miles sent it through the attorney channel exactly as Aaron required, and Aaron answered with one short line that she would move when the port trap was triggered, because only then would Moreau expose enough people and enough planted cargo to catch in a net. Katherine's heart pounded when she heard that, because the port trap wasn't just paperwork. It was something that could kill real people, and she feared Aaron was letting an incident happen to get proof. But Aaron wasn't a thrill-seeker guided by emotion. She sent Katherine, through Jace, a detail that made Katherine's skin crawl, that they had identified the plan to set off a container explosion for a very specific time, and Aaron was quietly staging a bomb squad, fire crews, and traffic control to turn the fake disaster into a controlled caught in the act, without innocent deaths. Rafe heard the plan, and his eyes darkened with the instinct to tear Moreau apart with his own hands. And Katherine saw the darkness in him twitch, but she also saw him remember the promise of a new code. Rafe turned to Jace and ordered that no one attacked first. No burning, no old-style revenge, only surveillance, recording, locking routes, and protecting civilians around the port. Katherine was not allowed to go out, but she no longer felt caged, because Rafe gave the reason plainly, that tonight they would turn Moreau into a criminal under law, and Katherine was the most important living witness, too valuable to lose. Toward dawn, the port became a vast stage. Sodium lights washed the containers in yellow. Forklifts moved slowly like mechanical animals, and under that ordinary surface, Aaron's invisible formation held. Unmarked vehicles, people in plain jackets, body cameras tucked tight, and a technical team riding the detonator signal. Moreau thought he was controlling an accident, but Aaron had removed the 2 things that turn an accident into a catastrophe: time and surprise. When a truck carrying a container fitted with a device rolled into the designated zone, Aaron ordered the gates locked. Police vehicles rose as if from the ground and cut off the exits, and a loudspeaker command rang out for everyone to stop. Hands up, nobody touch the cargo. A few men tried to run, but Aaron had already sliced the escape routes with blocking vehicles and officers positioned at every gap. And more than that, Aaron had the legal key ready, the fake bill of lading flagged in advance, the seal that didn't match standards, the interference logs, and the money trail tying the mole to an intermediary account, and then to one of Moreau's shell companies. Moreau didn't show up directly. He was too smart for that, but he had sent a trusted lieutenant, and that lieutenant became the link Aaron used to pull the net tight. When the bomb squad removed the trigger device from the container under camera, the truth stood naked like a blade, that this was not an occupational risk. This was a staged attempt to kill and frame. Katherine watched it unfold on a screen inside the safe house, her heart both racing and turning cold. And she saw something else too. She saw Rafe standing behind her with his hand on the chair back, instead of on her shoulder, like a man holding himself to his word with his whole body, refusing to turn an arrest into a slaughter even if Moreau deserved death by street law. Aaron made arrests by procedure: handcuffs, rights read, phones seized, documents taken, and every item collected tightened another rope around Moreau's neck, even though he wasn't there. At the same time, somewhere else, Brandon Pierce was taken in a way he had never imagined. Not by Rafe's threat, but by 2 agents stopping him at the steps as he walked out, presenting an arrest warrant and copies of transfers, chats, flight schedule details, and the envelope exchange footage. Brandon forced a thin laugh, tried to play victim, tried to claim he'd been pressured, that he only wanted a chance, but the cuffs closed with a sharp click that answered him with finality. Katherine wasn't there, but she could picture his face when he realized his climb ended in cold steel, and inside her there was no more pain, only a clean sensation, as if the cycle of selling a human being for money had finally been priced correctly. When morning rose, Aaron sent a short message through Jace that the net had closed, the evidence was locked, Moreau's escape had been cut, and from now on every step he took would be examined by the thing he hated most: verification. Katherine sat very still, hearing Rafe breathe behind her, and the small story closed on a clear reversal. Not because they were stronger, but because they had chosen the right method, turning Moreau's trap into his own, and flipping the board completely. A few days after the port was locked down and the net tightened around Moreau, Rafe didn't take Katherine to a fancy restaurant or a glittering penthouse. He brought her back to O'Hare Airport, the exact place where everything began with a fake embrace and a bullet buried deep in the wall behind her. The terminal was still as loud as it had been the first time, suitcase wheels whispering over tile, announcements repeating in an even rhythm, people arriving and leaving with no idea that gunfire and panic had once cracked through this air. Katherine slowed when she saw the stone pillar where he had pulled her into cover, and her heart no longer beat in wild disorder. It carried a deeper, steadier pulse, as if she herself had changed. Rafe stood beside her without the overpowering coldness he usually wore among his men. Here he was simply a man looking back at the moment that turned his life. He didn't kneel. He didn't open a sparkling ring box under the lights. He looked straight into her eyes and said, in a low but clear voice, that his life wasn't clean, and it would never be a fairy tale without scars. But in the new code they had written together, she would always be respected. She would be told the truth. She would have the right to say no. And above all, she would be safe within the reach of what he could protect. Katherine listened, no longer the panicked woman begging for an embrace to hide her pain, but a woman who had lived through the ambush night, through cold warehouses and battles of intelligence, and she understood that safety wasn't a free gift. It was the result of choices made every day. She answered him not with romantic vows, but with her own terms. That transparency mustn't break, that boundaries mustn't be crossed even in anger or fear, and that if one day he forgot the new code they had written, she would remind him, and if she had to, she would leave. Rafe nodded without hesitation, and in that nod there was more respect than any ornate promise. They stepped closer and held each other for real. Not to be seen, not to prove anything to the world, but to confirm that in a place that once rang with gunfire, they could stand still without trembling. In a far corner of the terminal, a shadow of a person watched for a few seconds, then turned and melted into the stream of travelers, leaving behind only the thin aftertaste that peace is not a permanent destination, but something that must be guarded with alertness and courage. Katherine understood that more clearly than anyone. She had once believed she was a victim of fate and of other people's bad choices, but this story taught her that real worth isn't found in landing a powerful man. It's in keeping your backbone and your principles while standing beside that power. Rafe also learned that strength isn't only the ability to crush an enemy. It's also the ability to stop your hand when you must, and to choose a path that spills less blood. Their lesson wasn't about the glamour of the underworld. It was about the fact that in the middle of life's chaos, people can still rewrite their own rules if they're brave enough and honest enough. And what about you? Where did this story touch you? Have you ever stood at a crossroads where you had to choose between fear and growth? Share what you feel in the comments so we can hear the voice from deep in your heart. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, tap like, and share this video to spread stories full of emotion and human value every day. Your support is the fuel that helps us keep telling more true and meaningful stories. Goodbye, and see you in the next video. I wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peaceful days. Farewell, and see you again.